This presentation is for people interested in meditation and its ontological implications. Anyone drawn to spirituality, metaphysics, philosophy, psychology, religion, or questions about the nature of reality. From the start, it's important to be clear, this presentation is long, provocative, and dense in places. That's not for effect, it's a consequence of the subject. If I'm making an ontological claim, one that applies universally, I can't rely on personal experience, inspiration, or authority. The last thing I want to say is, I experienced it, therefore it's true. Trust me, bro. That helps no one. If I'm speaking about ontology, then the claim has to be true and verifiable for anyone. And this matters because something subtle but consequential has been consistently overlooked in how meditation is understood. And when that oversight goes unnoticed, confusion follows, in theory, in practice, and in how insight itself is evaluated. The verification, however, is surprisingly simple. Ask yourself, what is meditation? If you understand this even once, really understand it, everything in this presentation will become clear. Maybe this isn't new, maybe it's something you've already noticed and then overlooked. Sometimes all we need is a reminder that there was a way of seeing before the shifts and a way of seeing after. Not as an achievement, but as a quiet reorientation whose implications touch everything. What I say may be provocative, even controversial, but I offer one concession. Nothing here requires you to take anything on faith, or to master every argument as it unfolds. The verification isn't intellectual, it isn't about agreement or interpretation. In the end, it's surprisingly simple. Notice what happens when effort drops. You can verify this for yourself. That's the entire point of this presentation. When I was a kid, I had a very simple thought. If the universe exists and I'm inside it, then nothing happening in me can be separate from it, not even my thoughts. I didn't have a name for this insight, but it stayed with me quietly like a question. If I am part of reality, then who or what am I really? I want to begin there, before any claims, before the philosophy. Because long before I cared about metaphysics or frameworks or insights, there was only one thing that really mattered, a longing I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a longing to feel better or a craving for comfort or self-improvement. It was a longing for something fundamental, something real, a longing for truth. And that longing came with a particular temperament. I didn't want beliefs, I didn't want doctrine, I didn't want anyone else's map of reality. I wanted to see for myself. That quiet childhood question is what eventually pulled me toward meditation. Not because I was spiritual, not because I understood what meditation was, but because it was the only thing that seemed to point past explanations. Meditation for me arrived as a verb, not an idea. The first path that didn't ask me to prepare or purify or become worthy. It only asked me to pay attention. The great contemplatives of the East didn't hand me a worldview. They didn't drown me in cosmology. They gave me something much simpler and more dangerous. Permission to trust the rawness of experience over the cleverness of explanation. Their clarity broke something open in me, long before I understood any of it. And I want to be clear from the start. I'm not a teacher, I'm not enlightened. I'm a student of this path, just like you. But there is something I am here to do, and I should say it plainly. I believe the modern West has misunderstood meditation at the ontological level. Not just methodologically, not just psychologically, ontologically, at the level of what meditation is. This is the claim the whole presentation turns on. If you're still watching, I'm going to assume meditation is a real question for you, not just a stress reduction tool, not just a lifestyle upgrade, something in you suspects that freedom is possible. Because for me, eventually, something became unmistakable. Meditation wasn't something I did. It wasn't a state I entered or exited. It wasn't an activity I stepped into and out of. It was pointing towards something fundamental, something already here, already present, already the ground beneath every moment. This is where the real shift happened. The boundary between meditation and daily life began to dissolve. Not metaphorically, literally. The supposed distinction collapsed under its own weight. Meditation revealed itself not as a practice within experience, but as the nature of experience itself when effort relaxes. And once that was seen, everything changed. The inquiry stopped being, how do I meditate? And became, what is meditation actually? And how did an entire culture place it in the wrong category? This presentation is my attempt to answer that, from humility, from curiosity, and from the same question that first appeared in a child looking up at a universe he somehow already knew he belonged to. After that first opening, after the boundary between meditation and daily life began to dissolve, I started to notice something I had never seen before. Most of us in the modern West don't encounter meditation the way the old traditions understood it. We don't meet it as a shift in being, we meet it as a technique, a psychological tool, a method for self-regulation, a way to breathe deeper, focus better, calm anxiety, manage attention, improve sleep, or optimize. Breathe this way, focus here, relax the body, tune attention, track sensations, count the breath. Apps, courses, retreats, workshops, almost all of them begin from this framing. And none of this is wrong. These methods genuinely help. They steady the mind, they open the body, they soften reactivity and ground. Techniques have value. They prepare the field, they create stability when everything feels chaotic. But as I kept practicing, something became impossible to ignore. Something essential was missing. The techniques were like teaching scales before introducing someone to Beethoven. Helpful, supportive, even necessary, but not the music itself. They cultivate conditions, they invite intimacy, they ease suffering, but they don't touch the shift. They don't reveal the movement that happens only when doing collapses. They don't point to the fact that meditation isn't produced, it's revealed. And this distinction between what helps and what the thing is exactly where the category error begins. Because once you mistake the scales for the symphony, you start trying to play the symphony by perfecting the scales. You start chasing the shift through the very mechanisms that prevent it, and an entire culture ends up looking for meditation in the wrong place. This presentation is about that mistake and what becomes possible when it finally comes into view. Once you enter the modern world of meditation, something unexpected happens. Instead of getting simpler, the landscape becomes crowded. Mindfulness, concentration, breathwork, mantra, visualization, somatic inquiry, loving kindness, open awareness, non-dual pointers, and endless hybrids. Sincere practices, real benefits, genuine attempts to help. But for many people, this abundance creates a strange kind of disorientation. The more techniques they encounter, the harder it becomes to understand what meditation is actually pointing to. You can spend years moving from method to method, collecting insights, refining discipline, and somehow the essential thing drifts further away. Not because the methods are flawed, but because the simplicity they were meant to reveal becomes buried under the very tools designed to prepare you for it. And that simplicity, quiet, immediate, already present, is what we've forgotten how to see. This is where many people eventually arrive, and it can be frustrating. They sit, they follow the breath, they repeat the mantra, they listen to the app, and yet in daily life, anxiety and reactivity remain. A story begins to take shape. Maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I need a different technique. Maybe meditation just doesn't work, at least not for me. The suffering isn't the original pain, it's the added sense of failure. This presentation exists in large part to dissolve that misunderstanding, not by offering a new technique, but by revealing that this frustration is not a personal flaw. It's evidence that the frame has been off from the beginning. Eventually, a quiet realization begins to surface. Maybe the confusion isn't coming from the techniques at all. Maybe it's coming from the lens through which we interpret them. Most of us approach meditation the same way we approach any skill. Learn the method, apply it, refine it, hope for results. And that makes perfect sense. It's how almost everything else works. But what if meditation doesn't belong in that category? What if the techniques are fine and it's the frame around them that creates the struggle? Because if the category is wrong, no amount of sincerity can reveal what meditation actually is. This misunderstanding didn't arise from failure, not yours, not your teachers, not the traditions. It arose from a far more fundamental reason. We placed meditation into a category it never belonged to. We treated it as a skill, a technique, a method for managing the mind. And once something is miscategorized, everything built on that foundation becomes distorted. Even discipline and mastery can't reveal the essence if the frame is pointing in the wrong direction. This is what philosophers call a category error, placing something into a conceptual box that doesn't fit its nature. Once that happens, no amount of effort, no matter how devoted, can make the thing behave the way we expect. Some errors can be fixed with effort, clear instructions, greater precision, more practice. A category error is not that kind of mistake. It's not about how you're doing something, it's about what you think the thing is in the first place. It's like trying to hold a shadow. It seems graspable, but the moment you treat it as an object, it slips away. Meditation has suffered the same misplacement. Once it was put in the wrong conceptual box, every attempt to make it work started from the wrong foundation. This mistake didn't come from malice or ignorance. When meditation arrived in the modern West, it entered a culture built on efficiency, self-optimization, and the promise of endless progress. We interpreted it through the frameworks we already knew. Therapy, science, productivity, personal development. All of these rely on the same architecture, specific techniques applied over time to produce a desired outcome. So meditation was absorbed into that architecture by default. It became something you do, something meant to generate particular states or solve particular problems. Once meditation is interpreted as a tool or intervention, its deeper nature becomes almost impossible to see. Western culture reinforces this lens everywhere. Most transformation follows the same pattern. There's a problem, you find a method, you apply it through practice, and with enough repetition, you improve. This model works beautifully in medicine, psychology, business, education, athletics. It rests on two assumptions. Something needs to change, and effort and repetition produce that change. This logic is so deeply woven into Western life that it becomes a default way of interpreting everything, including meditation. And here's the heart of the mismatch. The Western change model assumes transformation comes from adjusting experience, changing thoughts, regulating emotions, shaping attention. Techniques fit neatly into that logic. But meditation isn't fundamentally about adjusting experience. It's about how you meet experience, how you relate to what is already unfolding. That shift from control to relationship is subtle in language but enormous in practice. When meditation is placed inside the change model, it becomes another form of self-management. But when it's understood on its own terms, a different kind of transformation becomes visible. One that doesn't begin by changing anything, but by seeing how the attempt to change keeps the deeper movement out of view. This is where the category error becomes practical. When meditation is framed as a technique, it naturally starts to feel like something you must do correctly. Focus harder, relax better, control thoughts, settle the mind. But technique implies effort, and effort quietly implies resistance. The sense that this moment is not yet acceptable as it is. That resistance recreates the very tension meditation is meant to illuminate. So a paradox appears. The more you try to meditate, the more it becomes another self-improvement project, another attempt to manage experience. And in that movement, the essence is missed. Up to here, we've been clearing away the confusion. Meditation isn't a technique. It's not an intervention. It's not a method for producing special states. It's a shift in orientation, from controlling to allowing, from effort to ease, from managing experience to meaning it. And yet, across cultures and centuries, people describe this shift as profoundly transformative. They speak of clarity, spaciousness, freedom, insight, peace, even awakening, experiences that seem to touch something limitless. How can something so simple reach so deeply? The answer isn't psychological, it's ontological. Everyone teaches what meditation looks like from the outside. The posture, the breath, the technique, the state. But almost no one asks the real question. What is the actual movement that shifts you from trying to meditate into being in meditation? This is the question anyone who sincerely takes up meditation eventually has to face. It's a strange threshold. One moment you're efforting, and in the next, without warning, something relaxes, opens, or lets go. Everything feels different, not because the experience changed, but because your relationship to the experience changed. And if you look closely, you can't locate when or how that shift happened. This is where things become interesting, because whatever that shift is, it doesn't behave like a technique, a skill, or an intervention. And quietly, another implication appears. If this shift had a clear, reproducible cause, a predictable sequence you could follow, then meditation would collapse into just another method, a controllable procedure. Its potential limited by whatever produced it. Yet, that's not what happens. And this single question, what actually changes in that moment, turns out to be the heart of the entire story. If you watch closely, you can feel the exact moment the shift begins. You don't make it happen. You don't cause it. There's no inner command like, now I'm going to stop trying. Something simply stops holding. Attention softens by itself. The grip releases on its own, as if the system forgets to resist. You can't trace the movement. There's no sequence, no technique, just a quiet crossing that no one performs. And even then, experience still ripples, thoughts move, sensations rise and fall, nothing freezes, nothing becomes special. But the againstness is gone. The water shows you stillness isn't the absence of motion, it's the absence of resistance. Effort can prepare the field, steady the breath, settle the posture, narrow attention, but effort only shapes the contents of experience. It cannot touch your relationship to experience. Doing belongs to effort. This shift belongs to non-doing, and no amount of doing can produce non-doing. The release isn't an achievement, it's a revealing, something that appears when you no longer hold yourself apart. What shows itself is a natural ease you never created, only uncovered. A calm already here, even as the surface moves. What it reveals becomes unmistakable in ordinary life. When the inner struggle drops, things often improve across many dimensions. Clarity, relationships, anxiety, creativity. It can sound as if meditation helps everything, but the reason isn't mystical, it's structural. Many difficulties are amplified by a subtle background pressure. Not thought, not emotion, but a quiet friction between you and what is happening. The Buddha used the word dukkha to name this, the tension of meeting experience with resistance. When that tension relaxes, even briefly, the effects ripple everywhere. Not because meditation fixes many things, but because many things were being strained by the same underlying tightness. So the real question isn't why meditation improves everything, it's why the absence of that tightness reaches so widely. And the answer isn't psychological, again, it's structural, touching something at the heart of experience that Western models never fully captured. By now, the shape of the puzzle is becoming clear. The shift into meditation doesn't behave like a technique, it isn't produced by effort, can't be traced as a sequence of steps, and seems to release a single root tension that influences many parts of life. Something this direct should have been obvious, and yet the modern West did not describe meditation this way. It framed meditation as a skill to be trained, a practice to repeat, a method for altering the mind, a tool for measurable outcomes. Why? Not from lack of intelligence or sincerity. The West had brilliant thinkers, dedicated practitioners, and genuine attempts to help understand all of this. The confusion came from a deeper mismatch, the nature of the shift and the frameworks used to explain it. To see how that mismatch formed, we need to look at the most sophisticated Western responses, the people who worked the hardest to make meditation intelligible within scientific and psychological models. Their work is rigorous and often insightful, yet even the strongest frameworks struggle to account for the one thing at the center of the whole inquiry. Before any critique, it's important to honor the people who saw a real problem and tried to solve it. And part of honoring them is taking their framework seriously enough to understand why they arrived at the conclusions they did. The first is Ken Wilber. For those unfamiliar with him, Wilber is a major figure in contemporary spirituality, a synthesizer. He weaves psychology, contemplative traditions, developmental theory, neuroscience, and philosophy into a framework he calls integral theory. One of his key insights is simple and powerful. Meditation opens states, but your stage of development determines how those states are interpreted and integrated. That distinction reshaped the Western conversation. According to Wilber, you can have genuine non-dual experiences, unity, emptiness, peace, even deep meditative absorption, and still interpret those states through an immature or undeveloped lens. I saw this in someone I knew, a friend who could access truly luminous, unmistakably real states, yet the meaning they assigned to them was almost naive. Wilber's model explains that perfectly. He also points to decades of observation, showing that even advanced meditators can retain significant shadow elements. His contribution is essential because it highlights something the East often left unstated. Waking up is not the same as growing up, and meditation does not automatically develop the self-system. Wilber's framework is one of the most rigorous and sophisticated attempts to explain the gap between spiritual capacity and psychological maturity. He draws a crucial distinction. States of consciousness, temporary experiences anyone can access through meditation, psychedelics, trauma, peak moments, or grace. They can be described as unity, stillness, bliss, non-dual awareness, emptiness, formlessness. States are immediate, powerful, and real, but they're fleeting. Stages of development. The underlying structures that shape how you interpret those experiences. Your worldview, your values, your emotional maturity, your cognitive complexity, your capacity for perspective taking and integrating shadow. Stages develop slowly through culture, relationships, effort, and life itself. Entire cultures move through stages, which is why even historically awakened figures were still limited by the moral assumptions of their era. From this perspective, you can access advanced states at a relatively low stage. You can have profound meditative openings and still be narcissistic. You can experience non-dual awareness, yet remain emotionally reactive. You can touch spiritual insight and still lack relational skill, empathy, or moral maturity. This helps explain why some revered teachers, even those with real spiritual capacities, acted harmfully or unethically, and why people can sit on a cushion for decades and still struggle psychologically. In Wilber's view, the real work is not accessing states. Anyone can do that. The work is integrating those states into the self-system through gradual development. This distinction, waking up versus growing up, describes two different lines of development. And meditation, according to Wilber, primarily advances the first. This is one of the reasons I've always respected his framework. It's elegant, interdisciplinary, and it explains patterns that otherwise look contradictory. But, and this is where my question begins, it still rests on a deeper assumption about what meditation is, an assumption worth examining closely because this is where the category error begins. Wilber is only one strand of the Western response. His work clarified an important distinction, but it also left a broader question unresolved. How do we talk about meditation without relying on metaphysical or religious language? Many people, especially in scientific and secular circles, wanted an account of meditation that didn't rely on concepts like enlightenment, karma, or liberation. They wanted a version that fit the modern worldview. This is where Sam Harris, a neuroscientist, philosopher, and prominent voice in contemporary secular thought, becomes influential. If Wilber focuses on development and interpretation, Harris emphasizes secular clarity, presenting meditation in a way that feels compatible with science, rationality, and contemporary skepticism. Where Wilber integrates spirituality with developmental psychology, Harris represents the move to secularize meditation. His approach is straightforward: strip away metaphysics, religion, and tradition, focused entirely on direct experience. In Harris's framing, meditation becomes a way of examining the mind, a phenomenological inquiry into thoughts, sensations, and the sense of self. You don't need to believe anything or adopt a worldview, you only need to look. Through that looking, he argues, you can see that the self is constructed, that thoughts arise on their own, and that awareness is distinct from its contents. His work, including the Waking Up app, introduced meditation to millions who might have never approached it otherwise, especially within scientific and skeptical communities. For many, Harris provided the first language that made meditation feel rational, modern, and intellectually honest. Alongside Wilber's developmental framework and Harris's secular phenomenology, another major Western perspective emerged, one that did not merely reinterpret meditation, but attempted to situate it within a comprehensive science of cognition. This comes from John Vervaeke, a brilliant cognitive scientist, philosopher, and professor at the University of Toronto, whose work on wisdom and the meaning crisis has become deeply influential across academic and contemplative circles. Unlike Wilber's developmental psychology or Harris's secular phenomenology, Vervaeke approaches meditation through the architecture of cognition itself. He studies how human beings overcome self-deception, deepen relevance realization, cultivate wisdom, and reconnect with meaning. His work bridges neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, ancient wisdom, and embodied cognition. Meditation matters in his view, but it is only one process within a larger cognitive ecosystem. Human beings, he argues, operate through multiple ways of knowing: propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. No single practice can train all of them. They have to work together. This is why he emphasizes an ecology of practices, a coordinated set of exercises that afford attention, insight, embodiment, self-correction, social attunement, and transformation. Meditation sharpens attention. Contemplation deepens insight. Dialogical practices shift perspective. Embodied practices stabilize presence. Ethical action grounds it in the world. In this model, awakening is not a single move, but a reciprocal opening across multiple modalities of cognition. Vervaeke also brings in the language of opponent processing, the idea that many capacities function optimally only when balanced by their complementary counterparts. No single practice can regulate all of these processes. They must counterbalance one another. This is why, in his framework, no solitary technique, Not meditation, mindfulness, breathwork, or contemplation can be a complete path on its own. It's a sophisticated model that speaks directly to the complexity of cognition and the multifaceted nature of wisdom. And yet, as with Wilber and Harris, this view still rests on a shared assumption about the nature of meditation itself, an assumption we can now see clearly. Over the past decades, the West has offered thoughtful responses to the challenges of modern spirituality. Wilber clarified why profound states can coexist with undeveloped shadows. Harris secularized meditation, giving millions a way to explore insight without metaphysics. Vervaeke built an ecological model in which meditation plays one role among many in cultivating wisdom. Each contribution addresses a real problem and expands the Western understanding of contemplative practice. But beneath their differences lies a quiet, shared assumption that meditation is something the agent does to generate an outcome: improved behavior, deeper integration, better relevance realization, greater self-transcendence. Meditation remains framed as a method, a technique, and intervention. And this is the point that matters. If meditation is not an act of doing, but a shift in being, then even the most sophisticated Western models, including Wilber, Harris, and Vervaeke, place meditation in the wrong category. Seeing this clearly allows something deeper to come into view. Here is the question that quietly unsettles every Western interpretation of meditation. If meditation isn't a technique, isn't a skill, and isn't something the agent performs, then what exactly is the movement from non-meditation into meditation? This isn't abstract, it's something you can verify directly. Every time the shift happens, I can't locate a cause. The moment I try to do it, to make it happen, improve it, or control it, it disappears. And the return is always the same: a letting go, a release of effort, a softening of whatever was holding on. It feels less like producing something and more like aligning with what was already present, a recognition rather than an achievement. Which brings the question into sharp focus. If the shift isn't caused, isn't produced by effort, and isn't generated by an agent, then what kind of movement is it? This is where the Western frameworks begin to strain, because once you really notice this, meditation no longer fits inside the box of skills and techniques. It becomes a lived koan. What shifts when nothing is being done? And this is the doorway into the category error itself. We've reached the threshold of the category error, the point where the Western lens begins to bend. Because once you notice that meditation shifts precisely when doing stops, you meet a deeper assumption the West almost never questions. Change is always caused. A trigger produces a response. A process generates an outcome. A mechanism explains a transformation. This works flawlessly in nearly every domain we study: biology, behavior, cognition, therapy, skill acquisition. In those worlds, causality is the air they breathe. But meditation introduces something unusual. What if not all shifts are causal? What if some transformations don't arise from effort, practice, repetition, or intervention, but from the absence of them? Here's the structural point Western models cannot absorb. The cognitive system cannot cause the cessation of its own interference. A process cannot produce the end of the very activity it is producing. In other words, doing cannot generate non-doing. And this is where even the strongest Western frameworks, Wilber's, Harris's, and Vervaeke's, begins to bend. They can describe the effects of meditation, the benefits of meditation, the correlates of meditation, but none can describe the shift into meditation itself without smuggling in a causal mechanism. And this is where the category error becomes unavoidable. If meditation is the movement that begins where causality ends, then placing it inside a causal model, any causal model, miscategorizes it from the start. This isn't an academic mistake, it's structural. A non-causal shift being interpreted as if it must have a cause. Let me show you this through something Ken Wilber himself says, and I mean this with complete respect. He describes watching meditation teachers and students for 50 years and noticing a puzzling pattern. Awakening didn't causally fix many of the things they expected it to fix. Listen carefully to the structure of what he's saying, not the conclusions themselves.
We've watched them for 50 years, and we found that the waking up experience is profound, and it does a staggering number of things. But there are also a huge number of things that it doesn't fix at all. And you can just list, there are dozens, not even obvious things like it won't make you a great banker.
Wilber is absolutely right in his observation, given the framework he is using. And this isn't a critique of psychology or development, it's a critique of categorization. But notice the framework inside the frustration. It assumes that awakening should cause certain outcomes. That's the hidden architecture of the Western approach, the expectation that a shift in being must behave like a technique, a process, or a developmental achievement. Here's the subtlety. Meditation does transform life, often profoundly, but not as a causal output of practice. The changes arise as byproducts of alignment, not products of effort. From inside a causal frame, those transformations look missing or inconsistent. But from inside the meditative frame, they are expressions of a deeper orientation, not measurable effects that a method is supposed to reliably produce. And if you misunderstand what meditation is, you will misunderstand what you're measuring. You look for outputs instead of orientation. And orientation doesn't show up on a graph, but it shows up everywhere in a person's life. And when expected outcomes don't appear in a predictable pattern, the causal model remains unquestioned. We search for missing mechanisms instead of examining the assumption that awakening was ever meant to function like a technique that produces guaranteed results. This is the pattern that unites Wilber, Harris, and Vervaeke, despite all the differences. Wilber maps the developmental structures around spiritual states. Harris maps the attentional landscape before and after meditation. Vervaeke maps the cognitive ecology that makes transformation possible. Each of them offers real insight into the conditions leading up to meditation and the changes that tend to follow from it. But in all three, the shift itself never appears as the thing being modeled. What gets described instead are its signatures: the release of effort, the absence of a meditator, the sense that nothing was added and something simply stopped. Those descriptions are accurate, but they are always folded back into a causal frame as outcomes of technique, attentional training, or developmental process. And yet that moment does not behave like a technique, a skill, a cognitive operation, or a developmental milestone. It behaves like a non-move, a discontinuity in the grammar of agency. And because it is a non-move, every causal model hits the same limit. It can describe everything around the shift, but never the shift into meditation itself. This is the hinge. Science explains events through causes. A leads to B, neurons fire here, patterns update there, inputs generate outputs. Cognitive science explains cognition, developmental psychology explains growth, neuroscience explains correlates. But the shift into meditation, the movement from effort to non-effort, from doing to non-doing, from managing the experience to resting in being, doesn't behave like something an agent performs. There is no act of will, no technique being applied, no step being taken. In direct experience, the shift appears precisely when attempts to cause it stop. The moment you try to make it happen, it disappears. The moment trying ends, it becomes obvious. This isn't mysticism, it's phenomenology. The shift doesn't follow the grammar of agency. It isn't produced, initiated, or executed. It is the cessation of doing, not a refined or advanced form of doing. And because the shift is non-causal, it lies outside the reach of causal models, no matter how sophisticated. This is the category error, trying to explain a non-causal shift with causal machinery. Here's the real heart of it. If meditation were something you did, then effort would matter, technique would matter, skill would matter, developmental stage would determine access. But that's not what actually happens. Every single time, in my practice, in every tradition I've studied, and in the reports of countless meditators, the shift appears only when the attempt to produce it collapses, when the doer relaxes, when the project of meditation dissolves, when control lets go of itself. This is why no causal model can capture it. A causal process requires an agent or mechanism, but the shift into meditation is precisely the cessation of that mechanism, the moment the system stops interfering with itself. You cannot cause a non-action. You cannot do a letting go. You cannot effort your way into effortlessness. Meditation is the zero step, the moment resistance softens and reality reveals itself without interference. This is why I call it a non-move. It isn't initiated, it isn't produced, it isn't performed or improved, it isn't optimized. It's what remains when the architecture of doing falls silent. The turning point in meditation has no internal structure. And because there's no structure to describe, no causal or process model can explain it. Every technique points towards this, but cannot cause it. This isn't semantics, this is ontology. Meditation cannot be contingent, because something dependent on conditions cannot reveal the unconditional acceptance of all conditions. A cause cannot lead to the absence of causation. To understand how this misunderstanding took root, we have to look at the world meditation entered. When meditation arrived in the modern West, barely half a century ago, it entered a culture whose entire understanding of change rested on causality. Effort leads to improvement, practice leads to mastery, mechanisms explain transformation. Within that worldview, meditation had to be understood as something a person does, not out of malice or confusion, but because the Western operating system simply had no other category available. Psychology, neuroscience, and behaviorism all share the same assumption. Inner life is behavior, and behavior is something the organism produces. So, meditation was interpreted through that lens. It became a technique to repeat, a skill to refine, a method for altering the mind, a tool for measurable outcomes. But we've now seen that meditation refuses to behave like any of those things. The shift into it appears only when effort relaxes, which means it cannot fit inside a causal framework. This is the category error. We try to explain a shift in being using a model designed to explain doing. Western systems capture the conditions around meditation beautifully, but the essence itself slipped through the conceptual net because it doesn't belong to the ontology those systems assume. And this brings us back to the deeper question. Not how do we practice meditation, but what kind of shift is this if it isn't caused at all? Across many domains of nature, biology, physics, cognition, perception, certain transformations don't unfold step by step. They arrive all at once. This is the defining structure of a threshold. A threshold is discrete, a shift in kind, not degree, not something that inches forward, but something that snaps. Like water snapping into steam, or the instant an optical illusion suddenly resolves, confusing one moment, obvious the next. Thresholds are categorical, not incremental. They behave like a change of order, not a change of magnitude. And they are functionally irreversible. Once crossed, the system reorganizes around a new baseline. A new attractor emerges. What was seen cannot be unseen. This same structure shows up in consciousness. If awakening is a threshold, then it cannot be gradual because thresholds by definition are discontinuous. And it cannot regress because thresholds by definition are irreversible. Seen this way, awakening is not a slow developmental climb. It's a categorical shift, a phase transition in one's relationship to being. And this is why it cannot be produced through technique or accumulated through repetition. The shift is instantaneous. What takes time is everything that follows: the stabilization, the integration, the reorganization of habits, conditioning, and karmic momentum. So the distinction is essential. The shift is discrete. The integration is continuous. If awakening is a threshold, several implications follow immediately. First, a threshold cannot be produced step by step. A phase transition isn't the outcome of technique, effort, or repetition. It is non-causal by structure, a shift that appears as the machinery of doing falls silent. Second, if the shift is irreversible at the level of recognition, it does not live in memory. It isn't something you had, but a recognition that reorganizes the entire system. It doesn't occur as an event unfolding in time. The mind simply places a timestamp on what is experientially atemporal. This is why people speak of an awakening moment, even though the real shift can only ever happen now. Before and after describe structure, not chronology. Two organizations of being, not 2 points on a timeline. Third, because the shift is non-causal, discontinuous, and irreversible, it cannot belong to the same category as techniques, practices, or developmental skills. It is an ontological transition, not a psychological achievement. And this is where the category error becomes unmistakable. If meditation is framed as a technique, the possibility of a threshold, a discrete, irreversible shift in being, disappears from view. But if meditation is the threshold, everything clicks into place. The techniques, the developmental arcs, the cognitive refinements, they prepare conditions, support integration, shape what unfolds afterward. But they do not produce the threshold, they orbit it. This threshold is singular, one shift that changes the nature of all other shifts. And here's the part that's easiest to miss. This threshold isn't mystical or rare. It is simply the moment you understand what meditation actually is. Not a technique, not a skill, not an inner action you perform, but the recognition that nothing stands between you and reality, that acceptance takes exactly 0 steps. When that is understood, resistance collapses on its own. The shift doesn't happen because of the understanding. The understanding is the shift. This is why the threshold matters. It resolves the entire category error in a single stroke. The shift of meditation does not belong to the causal order at all, and that is precisely what makes it transformative. Once the threshold is understood, a deeper question comes into view, one we can no longer avoid. If nothing stands between you and reality, what is the reality you are no longer resisting? The shift doesn't give you a new experience. It simply removes the contraction that was filtering the one you already had. When that contraction releases, what remains is not a technique, not a state, but the ground that was present the whole time. And now the inquiry changes tone. Not analysis, not interpretation, a direct look. What is the nature of the ground that appears when effort falls away? Different traditions name it in different ways. Presence, awareness, suchness, emptiness, pure consciousness. But in this presentation, we're going to name something more precise and more essential to the entire argument. I want to clarify something. I'm not doing all this to feel good. I'm not meditating to perfect my mood. I'm not chasing a private island of bliss. Because what good is my inner freedom if the people I love are suffering? What good is the highest state if the world around me is in pain? I could enter the deepest samadhi imaginable, hold it for hours, days, or years. I could fulfill every dream of self-actualization, build a brilliant life, achieve success, win respect, gain status, and still something essential would remain unresolved. What good is any of that if everyone else is drowning? Even the Buddha wasn't seeking his own relief. He was seeking peace at the root of existence. This is why the Taoist insight pierced me so deeply. Watch the turmoil of beings, but contemplate their return. Each separate being in the universe returns to the common source. Returning to the source is serenity. What struck me was not that I could find serenity, but that every being is already held by the same ground. Ontological peace is not private peace. It is the recognition that no one stands outside the source. This is not describing a mood, it's describing reality. Everything rises and falls, everything suffers and resolves, everything returns to the same underlying ground. The source is serene, not because conditions are smooth, but because it does not resist anything. This is the heart of the threshold. When resistance collapses, you don't touch a special state, you touch the ground beneath all states. And here the core distinction becomes clear. Psychological peace is when experience feels pleasant. Ontological peace is when your relationship to reality is no longer adversarial. Psychological peace often follows ontological peace, but only as a byproduct, never the aim. You can be grieving, overwhelmed, exhausted, and still held by the same ground that doesn't waver. Ontological peace isn't withdrawal. It isn't detachment. It isn't escape. It's what allows compassion instead of panic, clarity instead of confusion, right action instead of reactivity. This is what meditation reveals, a peace that doesn't depend on the world changing, and that makes you more available to change the world. Here's what surprises most people. Ontological peace isn't withdrawal. It doesn't make you passive. It makes you available. When resistance softens, even for a moment, attention stops collapsing inward. Energy stops leaking into self-management, and something very simple comes into view, a natural direction. Before naming it, one clarification matters. A technique is something you apply. A principle is something that operates whether you try or not. Techniques are prescriptive, they tell you what to do. Principles are descriptive, they reveal how things move on their own. Not all principles are causal. Some describe forces, others describe conditions that become visible when interference stops. Gravity is a principle. You don't apply it, you align with it. The Tao is the same, not a method but the way life already flows. You can feel this even in ordinary life. You don't do honesty, you stop resisting the truth. You don't do presence, you stop resisting the moment. A principle isn't constructed. It shows itself when interference falls away. And that is exactly what happens when the inner fight quiets. You don't invent the next move, you recognize it. The situation itself begins to reveal what wants to happen, not through effort, but through non-interference. This is what I call an orienting principle, not something you perform, but something that becomes perceptible the moment you stop pushing against reality. It's not mystical, it's simply how life behaves when you're no longer bracing. This is why the Taoists could say, the sage does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone. Non-doing removes noise, it removes distortion, and what remains is orientation, the quiet intelligence already woven into that moment. And here's the part people rarely expect. When you stop bracing, the world stops feeling random. Patterns line up. Timings become uncanny. Situations meet you exactly where you are. Not because you caused anything, but because you're no longer distorting what's already unfolding. This is what we normally call synchronicity. Not magic, not manifestation, but the felt coherence of aligning with the way things already move. This is meditation in its mature form. Not a method you execute, but a principle you align with. People often ask, if non-doing is effortless, where does morality come from? We tend to think morality is something we apply, a framework, a code, a set of rules. But when the inner contraction softens, something very different comes into view. You become less defended, less preoccupied with yourself, less caught in self-protection, and in that openness, responsiveness shows up on its own. When you are genuinely well, you don't try to be kind. You don't manufacture compassion. It simply moves through you. When you're unwell, overwhelmed, anxious, triggered, you don't stop caring because you're immoral. You just don't have the capacity in that moment. You're trying to survive your own turbulence. This reveals something essential. Moral action is not a performance. It's what naturally appears when the mind is no longer fighting itself. And the same is true of joy. Children don't practice joy, they radiate it. Animals don't work at affection, it appears when they feel safe. This points to something deeper about consciousness. Joy is the default state, not an emotion, but the unobstructed expression of being when nothing is in the way. As adults, layers of tension bury that simplicity. When those layers soften, even briefly, we feel the return of a familiar baseline, a quiet, causeless joy. Not achieved, not earned, not constructed, revealed. Seen in this light, morality and joy aren't goals of awakening, they are signatures of alignment, how consciousness behaves when resistance is no longer running the show. Awakening doesn't make you indifferent, it makes you responsive. Having said all of that, even after this realignment, something essential remains true. Your old patterns don't vanish overnight. Awakening isn't a purge, it's a recognition, immediate and unmistakable, but the body and mind still carry their history. Habits continue, emotional reflexes still fire, the nervous system follows familiar grooves, patterns built over years don't evaporate the moment insight appears. And this is where so many misunderstandings about enlightened teachers with shadows begin. Harmful behavior, manipulation, abuse, exploitation is not the residue of awakening. It's the result of the West confusing charismatic states with realization, rewarding performance, projection, and spiritual identity in a marketplace that mistakes intensity for depth. None of that has anything to do with crossing a threshold. Here's the simplest way to phrase it. A state master says, I can enter samadhi whenever I want. One who is realized knows there is nothing to enter. And once that's understood, the picture clarifies. The dramatic displays we associate with spiritual power have nothing to do with what actually unfolds after awakening. The real residue is quieter. It's the momentum of conditioning, like a fan whose blades keep spinning after the power is cut, or a ship gradually changing course after its compass realignment. You can be deeply aligned and still feel an old reflex surge, not because anything has been lost, but because biology, memory, and environment unwind in time. Insight is timeless. Integration takes time. The threshold doesn't erase your history. It changes your relationship to it. And this is where the real test begins. When even the leftover momentum is allowed to unwind and nothing more is required for the path to be complete. In modern psychology and cognitive science, there's near total agreement. There is no panacea, no single technique that works for every person, every mind, every history. And that's true for techniques. Techniques live in the causal domain. They depend on repetition, learning, regulation, and effort. They produce specific outcomes for specific conditions. But what we've been talking about is not something produced. The shift from doing to non-doing, from control to allowing, from managing to simply meaning what is, appears only when effort relaxes. It has no cause because trying makes it disappear. It has no owner because the one who would claim it is what lets go. It has no timeline because it can only ever occur now. And because it isn't created, it isn't limited by personality, history, trauma, biology, or belief. It is structurally universal in a way techniques cannot be. This is why there is no panacea of practice. Doing is always partial. But there is a panacea in practice because the shift is not done, it's released. Every form of struggle, psychological, emotional, existential, contains some element of tightening against the moment. The shift we've been exploring undoes that tightening at its root. After this threshold becomes clear, practice stops being a project and becomes expression. You still meditate, contemplate, reflect, and study, not to repair yourself, but to live from what's already been seen. Techniques don't produce the shift. The shift transforms how techniques function. This is why the moment of release feels universal. Not because it grants power or perfection, but because it removes the one obstruction that made everything feel uphill. And this is the deepest meaning of enough. Not that life becomes smooth, but that experience exactly as it is no longer requires struggle to be met. The panacea isn't a method, it isn't a state, it isn't a technique. It's the recognition that the thing you were seeking was the absence of seeking itself. Seen without the category error, meditation across every tradition lands in the same place. One shift, one release, one alignment that changes your relationship to everything. A practical question naturally arises here. If meditation is an ontological recognition, not a technique, should I still meditate? Here's the clearest way I can answer it. First, if the recognition hasn't quite stabilized, if the mind is still searching for a click, meditation remains the most direct way of looking. Not to create the shift, but to notice the impulse that keeps missing it. Eventually, it becomes obvious that the click was never in the future. It was the quiet background of every moment, including the search itself. Second, if the recognition is already present, why meditate? You don't meditate to stay awakened. You meditate for the same reason you pause to watch a sunset. Because why wouldn't you? When resistance falls away, even sensations and thoughts are experienced as quietly pleasant, not because they change, but because nothing is pushing against them. Sitting in silence stops being something you manage or perform. It becomes a simple willingness to let experience unfold as it is. This sensation too, this thought too, this pain too, this joy too. Meditation stops being something you do and becomes a way the universe expresses love through you. Nothing to achieve, nothing to hold on to, only the ongoing affirmation. This moment too shall pass, and this moment too is worthy of love. At this point, it's important to widen the frame. The shift we've been describing, the release of grasping, the softening of control, isn't exclusive to meditation. Religious traditions, devotional paths, contemplative prayer, and even moments of overwhelming grief, wonder, or awe can open the very same movement. Every lineage has its own vocabulary for it: grace, surrender, kenosis, phanna, union, Buddha nature. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying meditation is superior. I'm not ranking traditions or building a new hierarchy. What I am saying is this: meditation showed me this shift with unusual immediacy, because it removes everything between you and the moment itself. No beliefs, no doctrine, no cosmology, just a quiet question at the center of experience. What happens when the impulse to control relaxes? In many traditions, this release is attributed to grace, devotion, ritual, or faith. Meditation reveals gently but unmistakably that the release isn't produced at all. It appears when effort softens. That's why meditation can feel so direct. It shows you that the path is empty. Nothing to accumulate, no identity to construct, no ladder to climb. Only the recognition, again and again, of a shift that is always available now. This doesn't diminish any tradition. It doesn't make meditation the best way. It simply explains why meditation often becomes the cleanest window into what all traditions ultimately point toward. Meditation doesn't give you something new. It reveals what has always been the case. And that's why meditation is ontological, not methodological. It points to reality, not to an achievement. We've come full circle, and before anything else, let me repeat what I said at the beginning. I'm not a teacher, I'm not enlightened, I'm a student of this path just like you. Everything I've shared grew out of my own confusion, my own suffering, my own attempts to see what meditation reveals when the noise falls away. So let me be clear about one thing. The category error is not that techniques, frameworks, or traditions are wrong. They are profoundly valuable. Ken Wilber's integral theory, Sam Harris's secular clarity, John Vervaeke's ecology of practices, the devotion, prayer, and surrender across lineages. These are not obstacles. They are sincere responses to the human condition. The category error is simply this: meditation itself does not belong inside any of those boxes. It's not a technique among techniques. It is the shift that makes all techniques intelligible. And once that shift is seen, even once, everything else becomes clearer, kinder, and more honest. This is why I recommend practice rather than rejecting it. After realignment, practice stops being self-improvement and becomes self-expression, something that flows naturally from being more available to experience. Community matters. Guidance matters. Therapy matters. Ethics, development, shadow work, all of it matters. Awakening does not erase pain. If anything, it brings you closer to it, because you no longer need to resist it. Pain becomes directional. It points towards the conversations, practices, and relationships that support the next step. But there is one final clarification. If you walk away from this presentation thinking, I crossed the threshold, please watch again. A threshold is not something you cross. It's not an achievement, an identity, or a spiritual badge. It's an ontological shift, something reality reveals, not something a person accomplishes. When recognition happens, it happens without a someone who could claim it. The story of when it happened is just the mind placing a timestamp onto something timeless. This matters because it removes the ego from the process. It keeps the path clean. And this is the deepest reason the threshold matters. It dissolves the fear of fear. The anxious grip on the future softens. The need to secure yourself relaxes. Not because fear disappears. Fear is part of being alive. But because the fear of fear loses its power. You become available to life, to death, to love, to the full complexity of being human. Meditation is an ontology. It doesn't add anything. It reveals what is. So I'll close simply. Everything you've ever sought, peace, clarity, freedom, meaning, has been here the whole time, waiting beneath the effort to reach it. Nothing to attain, nothing to escape, nothing to withdraw from. Only the rediscovery of what was never absent. No distance to travel, no one who travels it. Just a quiet return to what never left.